Thank you, Channing.
Hey, good morning. My name is Channing Arndt. I'm the Senior Director for Transformation Strategies at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and it's my pleasure to moderate this event today. We're looking at the El Nino event. It's ongoing in the tropical Pacific, and we're trying to look today at the implications of the El Nino event, in particular for Africa. We're doing this in collaboration with the Famine Early Warning System, USAID, and also with the NASA Goddard Flight Space Center or Space Flight Center here based in Maryland. So our format today is we have 4 separate short presentations, each one covering a specific aspect, and we'll do question and answer after each short presentation. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in to the chat or other means for asking questions. After each one, a moderator will take your questions and we'll try to pose those to each of the speakers. The topics today, we'll start off with an overview, what's going on in the tropical Pacific and what does it mean for weather patterns and outlook for the upcoming agricultural season in Africa broadly. We'll look in more detail at these implications of the El Nino event for markets and particularly for rice markets, because this is the most important crop that's likely to be affected coming into African markets. And then we'll look subnationally at implications in 3 specific countries: Ethiopia, Malawi, and Zambia. And finally, we'll dive down and do a pretty detailed socioeconomic analysis for Malawi. So without further ado, I will pass over to the moderator for the first talk. And this is Karen Tabor, who is the agroclimatology advisor for the NASA Goddard Space Center. Karen, could you please come in and take over? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here today to moderate the session for my colleague, Weston Anderson. Weston is an agroclimatologist who researches the dynamics of climate variability and its relation to food production using reanalysis products, remote sensing, and modeled simulations. He is an assistant research scientist with the University of Maryland's Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center, and also with NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. All right, Weston, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Karen. So today I'm going to be talking about the El Nino Southern Oscillation and a little bit on the basics of what it is and how we expect it to affect crop yields globally. Next slide. So the El Nino Southern Oscillation is a coupled mode of climate variability in the tropical Pacific, which just means that it is a way that the ocean and atmosphere evolve together to reinforce one another and remain in a particular state. In this case, when we're talking about El Nino conditions, we're referring to warm sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific, the tropical Eastern Pacific, which enhances convection and precipitation in the Eastern Pacific and modifies the atmospheric circulation throughout the tropics. And this is important because this modification of the atmospheric circulation is how the El Nino Southern Oscillation affects the probability of there being drought, not just in the tropical Pacific, but really globally. So this coupled mode of variability tends to develop in June and July, or boreal summer, tends to peak right around now in November through February, and then it tends to relax back towards neutral conditions in March through June. The animation on the left is an example of how these sorts of events tend to develop, with warm sea surface temperatures peaking in boreal winter and decaying, often followed by La Nina conditions. Next slide. The El Nino Southern Oscillation isn't the only mode of climate variability, and it's not the only one that's active presently. There's also the Indian Ocean Dipole, which affects the African continent as well. This is a similar mode of variability to the El Nino Southern Oscillation in that it's also a coupled mode of variability in the ocean and atmosphere, which affects precipitation probabilities throughout the continent. Next slide. Now, the reason that we care about these modes of variability is because they affect the likelihood of droughts and flooding, both globally and, in this case, throughout Africa. What we're showing here is the probable impacts based on historical El Niños, where these brown areas are drier than normal, tend to be drier than normal during El Niños. These green or blue areas tend to be wetter than normal. And this isn't deterministic, but we can think of this as El Nino loading the dice towards a wetter growing season or a drier growing season, respectively. And what you can see is that as we are in an El Nino state and a positive Indian Ocean dipole state, that these two states tend to reinforce one another, particularly over Eastern Africa, where both of these events will load the dice towards a wetter season during September through December throughout Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa, and it loads the dice towards drier conditions from October through December or October to April in Southeastern Africa. Next slide. Now, the benefit of both of these conditions is that while they may create adverse growing season conditions, they're predictable. And in fact, both of these have been predicted. So here, what we're showing in the larger image on the right is the forecast presently for the evolution of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or the El Nino Index, from current through July, August, and September. So here we have a forecast for an intensity that's likely to peak at about 2 degrees Celsius. And for reference to past El Nino events, this puts us at slightly weaker than 1997-98, 2015-16, or 1982-98. 82-83 events, which were thought of as very strong or super El Niños. So the current event is quite strong. It's likely to be a little bit less strong than the strongest El Niños on record, but this will have a significant impact on growing conditions and is already having that impact. In the bottom left, we're showing a similar plot for the Indian Ocean Dipole Index, which is a measure of the strength of the Indian Ocean Dipole, which again contributes to those conditions that we're seeing. And likewise, we have a forecast, and we're currently experiencing quite a strong Indian Ocean Dipole. So both of these events together, both being quite strong and happening at the same time, has fairly strongly affected the probabilities for flooding and drought throughout Africa. Next slide. Now, if we look at moving away from just precipitation and start considering how these events actually affect crop yields throughout the world, we can think about this in two ways. We can look at first the image on the right. What I'm showing is deviations from expected crop yields, which means that these are deviations from average crop yields from a low frequency mean, and taken at the country level. And you'll see that there's really a distribution of expected impacts similar to what we saw in the distribution for precipitation. So notably, there's poor maize, soy, and sorghum yields throughout Southeastern Africa, and a modification of a number of crops globally. Now, if we want to understand how this affects global totals, we can look at the plot on the left. And what this plot is showing is a box plot of global average yields throughout, after aggregating across all countries during all past El Nino events. So each circle is an El Nino event. The box plot shows the distribution of these El Nino events, and the size of the circle is proportional to the strength of the El Nino event. So while many crops offset one another, notably wheat, sorghum, and maize tend to aggregate up to a global average that is more or less around zero. There's a large spread around zero, meaning that areas that have better than expected yields tend to offset areas that have worse than expected yields. This isn't true for every crop, and notably rice. So if we look at rice here, the span of the box being the interquartile range, you see that during El Nino events, there tend to be a 0 to 2% global deficit in rice yields. And this is because El Nino tends to favor drought throughout Asia, East, South, and Southeast Asia. And loading the dice towards drought in this way tends to load the dice towards slightly poor rice yield anomalies. Next slide. Now, if we look at those rice yield anomalies in a little more depth on a country scale, we can see on the left, again, the distribution of expected fractional yield anomalies. But on the right, we see the similar box plots, but now, while we're showing El Nino and La Nina on the left in the regional total, we can look at the country-specific averages on the right. And what we see is that the distribution of yield anomalies is negative for some key exporting countries, including India and Thailand, which were the largest exporters last year. So while there are many countries in which El Nino does not strongly load the dice one way or the other, it does so in some potentially important exporting countries. And our colleagues will talk about that more later. Next slide. We can also look at the distribution of impacts for maize, and we tend to see that the impacts in that case are far stronger and tend to be in the 10 to 15% below normal for Southeastern Africa, which is part of the motivation for looking in more depth at these impacts later in the presentation. These impacts are, of course, of interest to the famine early warning system, and some of the ways that FuseNet tends to highlight this is using things like these special reports. So here, as this El Nino developed and as it continues to develop, we're monitoring the impacts, understanding historical events for the likely impacts, and issuing these sorts of special reports and briefs to continue to understand, monitor, and track the impacts, not just on crop production, but as they ripple through to food security. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation and hand it back over to Karen.
Great. Thank you, Weston. I do have a couple of follow-up questions for you. First, thank you for that presentation. It's really great to see how clearly you articulate the effects of El Nino globally. One question I have is in areas where you have excessive rainfall, does that mean that there may be a better crop production, or can it
Mhm.
negatively affect crop production?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good question. And one reason that it's important to start digging into the impacts of these modes of variability beyond just looking at the precipitation, because you may see something like increased precipitation in Eastern Africa, for example, and think that that's positive. But as for anyone that's following current events in the Horn of Africa knows, there's excessive flooding throughout the region. And these sorts of impacts can have really complex implications for both crop production and food security, because on a crop production level, you can wash away crops, you can waterlog crops, you can create adverse growing conditions from this flooding, even as this increased precipitation breaks a historic 5 to 6 season consecutive drought. So while the increased precipitation is the way that we're exiting from a historic drought driven by La Nina, it can also be damaging in and of itself.
Great, thank you for that. We do have a question from an audience member. So the question is, what advice would you give corn-growing smallholder farmers in Zambia on rain patterns and when to plant corn during this period?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we'll get into a little bit more when we dive into Zambia in particular, because Zambia really sits at the edge of the influence of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And what I mean by that is that while the El Nino Southern Oscillation very strongly affects both maize production and precipitation patterns in, say, Zimbabwe and South Africa by loading the dice towards drought and poor growing conditions throughout the season, Zambia sits right on the edge, the northernmost extent of the influence. And this means that the southwest of the country tends to experience more drought more frequently than further north, which can even experience positive teleconnection. So really, the probable adaptation depends on where you are in Zambia, with the Southwest more likely to experience drought. And we also see that the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the impact tends to ramp up throughout the growing season, so that its influence in October, November, December tends to be a little bit weaker than once we get to December, January, and February. And this influence is amplified by the Indian Ocean Dipole, which also tends to create drought throughout southeastern Africa.
Great. We have another question from the audience. Can you please explain more about the Indian Ocean Dipole?
Certainly. So the Indian Ocean Dipole, similar to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, is a mode of variability that has sea surface temperatures evolving with patterns of precipitation. And so it also affects global atmospheric circulation through this reinforcing pattern where with, in this case, colder sea surface temperatures in the eastern Indian Ocean, warmer sea surface temperatures in the western Indian Ocean. So you tend to shift your convection west in the Indian Ocean basin, which is why we're enhancing precipitation over the Horn of Africa, which is part of what's driving this flooding event. Now, the Indian Ocean Dipole is a shorter-lived event than the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So whereas the El Nino Southern Oscillation tends to have a life cycle of around a year from when it develops to when it decays, the Indian Ocean Dipole often develops and decays in more of a maybe 6-month time horizon. So you'll see that while it didn't develop until October of this year, while the El Nino developed in June or July, it will likewise decay and subside going into the spring in January, February, March. So it can be thought of as very similar to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, although its influence is more localized to the Indian Ocean rim countries, and its influence in time is a little bit more localized in terms of its time scale for developing and decaying.
Great, thank you. Probably have time for one last question. And my question is going to be, so you showed the slide with some crops on a global scale don't show, they show they're about average out. And that's, of course, is averaging across a global scale. How disruptive is El Nino for local food security and local production for some of those crops, like wheat and maize?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question, because you can think about how the El Nino Southern Oscillation either affects crops on a global scale that in a way that may disrupt markets, but also locally, as we're considering local trade patterns, it can be particularly important for prices and food security as well. So throughout Southeastern Africa, if there are major trading partners that are importing their maize from South Africa, and you can look at Zimbabwe as a potential example, it's getting hit twice because both its own crop production is declining and its major source of imports is declining. So there are regional patterns to its influences, and there's also a rippling effect by which a regional influence, which may be stronger than the global average, will affect both that country and then also its trading patterns. So really, to understand the influence of the El Nino Southern Oscillation on production and food security, we need to understand patterns of trade, where countries are getting their food from, whether it's within their own borders or outside of them, and how these different regions tend to be influenced by El Nino, because these events are, at least to some degree, predictable, although each develops differently, meaning that we can't perfectly predict these impacts.
Great. Thank you so much, Weston. All right, I'll hand it back to Channing for the next speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Weston. As Weston indicated, we expect in general for an average El Nino for growing conditions for rice to be negatively affected. So we're going to pass on and look at implications of this El Nino event for global markets, and we'll take a special look at rice. And the person who will be moderating this session is Vivian Hoffman. Thank you for joining us, Vivian. She's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She's in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit. Vivian, please take over. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Channing. And I'm very pleased to introduce today both Joseph Glauber, who's a senior research fellow at IFPRI, also in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit. Joe also serves as the interim secretary of the Agricultural Market Information System, hosted by FAO, as well as Abdullah Mamoun, senior research analyst at IFPRI. Joseph and Abdullah will speak about how global markets and countries have reacted to the current El Nino event. Over to you, Joseph.
Thanks very much, Vivian. Yes, as Vivian said, I'm currently acting as AMIS secretary. AMIS is a G20 platform that monitors agricultural markets, and certainly the El Nino event is something that we've kept a close eye on over the last few months, particularly for its impact on rice. But as Weston mentioned, it also certainly Southern Africa, looking at corn, looking at wheat in Australia, and also in South America, where we see better, where the anticipation is for higher yields. And in any event, I'll be looking at rice. Rice is very interesting. Again, as Weston mentioned, this is one area where El Nino typically has an adverse impact, but doesn't really have a beneficial impact like it would, say, for wheat market or corn market, where we might see increased yields in places like South America. Here, most rice that's exported in the world is in Southeast and South Asia. And so these are markets that right now are potentially adversely affected. And so on top of that, what we'll look at here are how government policies also have interacted to further exacerbate supply shortfalls. Next slide, please. So this is just a charts taken from the AMIS Market Monitor, something that comes out monthly. And it just, interestingly enough, what AMIS and U.S. Department of Agriculture and the International Grains Council are all showing higher rice production for 23-24. Understand that last year we had a poor rice crop in Pakistan because of flooding, and so that's part of the issue is the base of comparison. But it's just to say that even though we have had production shortfalls this year, right now the forecasts are calling for higher production. Now, understand that rice is interesting crop because it has more than one crop per year. You can, in some countries, up to 3, sometimes even 4 separate crops that can extend over several months during the year. So where an episode like El Nino may have an adverse effect on one crop, the next crop may be better, or an earlier crop may be come through fine. So that's, in one sense, what's showing what's going on in these markets. Next slide, please. So I will focus a little bit here on India, because India, which is the largest rice exporter in the world, accounts for about 40% of rice that's traded in the world. It has had a number of taken a number of actions that has potentially restricted the rice market, and extending all the way back to last fall, where they put a ban on broken rice and also imposed a 20% additional levy on unmilled and milled rice. That was followed by actions taken this summer in late July, where they put a ban on a non-basmati rice, those non-basmati white rice, which excludes parboiled rice, but and then also have put on actions on parboiled rice and on basmati rice. Next slide, please. You can see just what the potential impact of that is, particularly say something like non-basmati white rice, very large, about almost 17.8 billion or million tons traded. If you look at the white rice accepting parboiled and excluding basmati, that's about 6 million. Broken rice around almost 4 million last year. So roughly 10 million tons of trade are currently under bans. As we'll see, that's not the impact isn't going to be nearly that severe, and that's largely because despite announcing the ban, India continues to export both for humanitarian reasons to countries, poorer countries, and also to neighboring countries, and also honoring current contracts that they might have for deliveries of rice. So the impact will be less than the 10 million, but in the next slides, we'll see exactly what's happened over the first few months that we have data. So this is just shows that export is down almost 56%, so almost half in September. And the real declines, obviously, in broken rice, in the non-basmati, excluding parboiled categories. And then in September, we saw a big decline in parboiled as well, as those additional duties were put on parboiled rice. Next slide, please. We can show where those exports go. Non-basmati white exports go to a lot of places in sub-Saharan Africa. I just picked Madagascar since that's one of the large markets for Indian non-basmati white rice. And you can see there the impact just particularly over the last several months, but the last 2 months in particular. Next slide, please. And then broken rice, which broken rice is used by some countries as an animal feed. So last year, China had a record amount of imports of broken rice from India. And in large part, the big surge in exports of broken rice caused India to put on those export bans last year that had an immediate impact on exports to China. However, they continue to export broken rice to places like Senegal, which is a very large importer of broken rice, which is used for food purposes there. But however, you can see over the last couple of months, those exports have gone down very much. Looking forward, the question will be, well, will India continue to ship some, like they did last year, to places like Senegal and other places in sub-Saharan Africa? Next slide. And then lastly, parboiled rice exports. When the ban went into effect in late July on non-basmati white exports and broken exports, you saw a big surge in parboiled rice exports in August. That then India then put on a 20% additional duty on those exports, and then those exports all declined in September. So I think that the next slide, there have been some other countries that have taken actions. There was rumors that Myanmar might put on export restrictions. In the end, they put into place an export licensing system. Thus far, it does not seem to have had an impact on exports, which is good news. Myanmar is about 5% of the world market currently, and so they're an important player. And then you have some importing countries put on things like price controls. We had that in the case of Philippines. That was rather short-lived. I mean, price controls for things like retail prices may make sense, but what happens is that merchants and others try to move around those export controls and or price controls and either refuse to sell, or a black market essentially develops for that. And I think there was a lot of protests at the time. The Philippines, after a month, took off those price controls. I think the good news is unlike 2007, 2008, where we saw very, very high prices as a result of exports restrictions that were put on at the time by countries, big exporters like Vietnam and Thailand and India and Pakistan. Almost 80% of the market of the exporters back in 2007-8 put on rice restrictions on exports. Rice prices tripled over that period. We haven't had that this time around. Really, India is the only one. Again, the hopes are that these actions will be short-lived and that we'll see a return to, with India exporting more as we get into 2024. With that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Abdullah.
Thank you, Joe. So let's look at the price reaction of these export policies by India. So next slide, please. So if we look at the international price of rices, we see that there is a spike in different varieties, like Thailand and Vietnam rice prices has gone up. On an average, international price of rice has gone up by 20% since the announcement of export ban by India on non-basmati white rice. If you look at the India, even the India rice, 25% broken rice, which is still, it is also going up. But the reaction we see in other major rice exporters like Vietnam or Thailand, their rice prices has gone up significantly because the importers are now looking to alternate markets. So which here Vietnam and Thailand are coming, and their prices have gone up. Next slide, please. So what about the retail prices? We see that in most of the retail price market, the price has gone up. The largest spike we see in Uzbekistan, followed by Haiti, Mali, Tanzania. Only a few markets that has seen a drop in rice prices, but most of the markets have seen a large spike in retail prices. Next slide, please. So here is an interesting case I would like to present here. The Bangladesh is the largest consumer of rice. Almost 67% of their daily calorie intake is coming from rice. But interestingly, Bangladesh has been able to see that the price of rice has remained stable in this year. Even in some cases, the price has gone down per kg. where the food inflation, overall food inflation is 12-year high, almost 12.5%. So how the country has been able to achieve this stability in rice prices? A couple of factors. The consecutive good harvest of rice, the Bangladesh has been able to see that. This year, the almond production, which is based on the monsoon season, looks good. The country has been able to also implement a strict anti-hoarding law, which passed in April this year. And the government of Bangladesh took advanced decision to import rice from countries like India and other markets. This has also contributed to the stability in rice market. The country has subsidized almost 10 million households rice supply to 10 million households. So this has also helped to make the rice market stable. So this gives us a lesson that how good policy of input subsidy or subsidy in the market in terms of the cash subsidy to the consumers that help to keep the rice market stable. Next slide. So what is the summary of these export trade policies? We see that the ban is potentially will impact the 50% of its exports, but the globally 20% of the world trade is likely to be impacted by the export ban and the taxes on other varieties of rice. So, and the price is going up. We have seen that 20%, the price has gone up by 20% at the international level. But this will depend on whether the El Nino will have a more significant impact in Southeast and South Asian rice production. We have to keep monitoring of the situation in harvesting this month and then in the coming month. And we also want to see whether other rice suppliers will follow the restrictions that were imposed by India. So, but the good news is that the ASEAN countries were the other large exporter of rice, like Thailand and Vietnam. They are not going to, or they will refrain from any export restriction policies. So this is a good news for us. So overall, the market is up, the price has gone up. We have to keep monitoring of the situation on the ground. Thank you.
Sorry, Mike. Thanks very much, Joseph and Abdullah, for the excellent presentation. It's clear that this El Nino event has really rippled through the global food system and caused disruptions across the globe. And I'm struck by the extent to which one country, India, really dominates the international rice trade. What a huge impact the policies of a single country can have on the supply of countries that rely on imports of this commodity. India's imposition of export restrictions on rice seems to stem from a classic externality problem, as we call it in economics, right? These are restrictions that benefit a segment of the Indian population, at least a segment, by keeping prices down. Of course, there are also farmers within India who are presumably hurt by these lower prices. But the main cost of higher food prices is on consumers in net rice importing countries, where the restriction of international supply has really caused prices to rise dramatically. So both of you, as well as many others, have written about the negative consequences at the global level of such actions, including the exacerbation of price volatility when we have supply disruptions due to things like a global pandemic or extreme climate events like this one. And we can, of course, expect these to increase over time. So could you talk a bit about the mechanisms through which the international community can discourage countries from taking these sorts of unilateral actions of restricting exports? And what tools do we have? Why are these tools not strong enough or not used enough to stop these sorts of actions? And do you see any prospect of strengthening international cooperation in this arena going forward?
Yeah, Vivian, no, it's a great question. And certainly with export restrictions, you're absolutely right, where they're targeted to help the domestic consumer. As you rightly point out, oftentimes the domestic producer is actually hurt because they don't get to enjoy the higher prices that they would see had there not been the export restrictions. And oftentimes, remember that the raw commodity price is actually a small part of the retail price. So you have all these post-farm gate costs on transforming the rice and milling the rice and getting it to stores that actually have a lot of value and won't be affected by whatever actions you're taking on these export restrictions. So the impact on domestic food inflation may be quite muted, is my point. So, but the impacts on world markets, as we've seen in certainly previous episodes and in the current one, as Abdullah had pointed out, that that's a big impact can be a very large impact on world market prices. So what can the global market what can the world do? The World Trade Organization recognizes the rights of countries to impose export restrictions, but they do have reporting requirements. Countries that put in export restrictions are supposed to report, and unfortunately, the reporting is not very timely. Oftentimes, doesn't happen at all. And in fact, Abdullah and colleagues at IFPRI have been tracking export restrictions, and frankly, they spent a lot of time just looking at news reports and other things around the world, seeing what the press and others are reporting that countries are doing. To get that information from the WTO may take months later. Do you actually get a reporting to that? I will say the WTO has taken up the issue of exports of humanitarian aid. So a big concern is, of course, if the World Food Program, which procures a lot of wheat and rice and other commodities from countries and then ships it to those countries in need, the WTO members agreed at their last ministerial last year that they would prohibit any export restrictions going in that would affect World Food Program exports. And I think that's a very positive step, but it's a small portion of what's traded in the world. And unfortunately, as we know, these impacts have the impacts of an export restriction largely are on prices. Prices doesn't matter where you are. Prices rise globally. And so the humanitarian aid is important, but it's a small portion of rice supplies. So we still have this very serious problem, I think, and WTO members have been trying to grapple with it, and there have been proposals to impose more restrictions and other things, but up until this point, we don't. There's been very little progress there.
Thanks, Joseph. I'm curious, since this is a predictable event, right? We have forecasts for El Nino in advance. Are there actions that countries can take? Similar, I think Bangladesh did some of this. In Abdullah, you mentioned the rice supply hasn't gone down there as much. And I wonder if other countries can adopt strategies that are sort of forward-looking to avert potential price spikes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll let Abdullah also chime in here, but you're right. We watch this El Nino develop, but I think as Weston pointed out earlier, it's very unclear in terms of what the actual impact will be. And in some years they're mild events, and in other years they're very serious. You look at what happened in Australia, you had Australian producers choosing, because of the potential for a severe El Nino, they chose not to plant as much wheat as they normally do. So wheat production, we've known, is going to be down in Australia largely because already farmers were anticipating it and not planning. And I think similar, we had a question in the earlier session about what should a Zambian corn farmer do, in reaction. So you do get some of that. But Abdullah, you might want to talk a bit more about Bangladesh.
No, actually, this is a good question, Vivian. The policies that were implemented because Bangladesh has such a high dependency for calorie intake on rice, the government is really worried about, and they took a number of measures. And over the years, we have seen that Bangladesh is subsidizing heavily on the fertilizer or on the seeds and in other imports. So that helps the farmers to keep growing the rice production. And this year, weather is also helping the country to have the market have a good production. I just want to add some other points. Like we have seen the EMI's weekly summary report where other countries are taking action. Like Indonesia, a few weeks back, they put price control measures in domestically. I have seen also the Philippine government has ordered to import additionally 1 million tons of rice. This is the news just came out last week. So yeah, we are seeing the reaction from other large consumers of rice. So I think the Bangladesh the policy coupled with input subsidy policy coupled with the price control or the subsidy to the consumers that help the market to stabilize. Yep.
Great, thanks, Abdullah. So I see some questions in the chat. First of all, would changes in fertilizer costs due to spikes in energy prices and other factors explain some of the increase in rice prices beyond the El Nino effect?
Certainly fertilizer prices, like other commodity prices, hit record levels last year, and I think the difficult thing is to sort of assess those impacts, on crop production, because as I say, if you look at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, you look at International Grains Council, look at Amos, they're all showing, for the most part, larger yields. Certainly last year, almost every country except for Pakistan had higher rice yields. So it obviously didn't have much impact on, or at least a casual glance would suggest it didn't have much impact on rice production. Whether or not there's longer term impacts, particularly since we do have export restrictions on phosphate fertilizers and nitrogen fertilizers out of China. We've had Russia has had difficulties exporting potash. There's been sanctions on exports of potash from Belarus. All those have created a lot of churn in the global market for fertilizers, as you've seen countries seek other sources. So in some cases, India has imported actually more fertilizer from Russia over the last year, whereas countries like Brazil, the world's largest importer of fertilizers, had to go to increase imports from Canada for potash, for example. And so, but the overall impacts on yields, IFPRI has a project ongoing right now that's trying to assess that in more detail and to sort through those impacts. And James or someone may want to comment on that later. But yes, it certainly could have an impact, but it hasn't really manifested itself, at least in the global data that we're observing.
Great, thanks. One last quick question. Do we have any forecasts on production prices in the Indian market or that area and generally for the next few months coming up?
No, the forecasts are certainly are for the crop year, and so that's really the key thing. And they have been reduced since. So most of these forecasting platforms like USDA's or International Grains Council, they begin in the spring. So in May, they start to put out forecasts. All those forecasts have been reduced substantially or significantly over the last 3 or 4 months, as we've seen what the impacts of El Nino have been. But I don't think they're nearly as devastating as many people had anticipated. And indeed, globally, we're showing, rice production up. But it's important to remember about rice that rice really does vary a lot by variety and consumer demand. So, people who buy a lot of basmati rice may not see white rice as a perfect substitute in any sense. And so all these things can have local and regional and impacts.
Okay, well, thanks. I think we're out of time for our session. Thanks very much, Joseph and Abdullah. That was fascinating. Back to you, Channing.
Thank you very much, Vivian, Joseph, and Abdullah. We're gradually shifting west here. So we started with the tropical Pacific, and then we looked at rice markets and what's going on, exports to sub-Saharan Africa. And now we're going to look in more detail into Africa, specifically Ethiopia, Malawi, and Zambia. And I will pass the moderation to Liz Agotu, who's a policy analyst at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Liz, please go ahead. Thank you very much. Liz, you're still muted.
Yes. Thank you, Channing. And in the next session, we will be looking at the yield and populations affected by El Nino with Dr. Liang Ji Yu, a senior research fellow in IFPRI's Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit. His current research focuses on modeling agricultural land use, systems, and in the next 10 minutes, he will expound on estimating the impact of climate change and climate variability on food security in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Zambia. Liang, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Nitz. I think the slides is up. Yeah, I will actually present this spatial space of the subnational, the impact of Nino, the three represented countries, as Lisa said. Next slide, please. Ethiopia, Malawi, and Zambia. Yeah, I will start with Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a little bit complex in terms of El Nino impact. Here we use drought index at actually pixel level. This is very special. Circuit pixel size here is where I talk about 5 minutes by 5 minutes, roughly about 10 kilopixel. We actually use the rainfall, the chirps, this company use rainfall estimates data to look at this kind of rainfall deficit. So you will put the rainfall data into the three categories: normal, slight dry, moderate dry, and extremely dry. And then we define the drought as drought or long drought. You are talking very small piece of land, right? Mere pixel. Category 3, 4, and 5 is a moderate dry, very dry, and utter drought. And if you look at there, and then we look at the last 33 years where we have this kind of data, and then we look at the 5 crops, the major crops: barley, maize, and sorghum, teff, and wheat. And then what I'm going to present is what is the impact on these 5 crops. Look at the drought, as I defined as drought index. Next slide, please. Here, we are looking at this over the 32 years, all the way from 1990 to the current years. Actually, is I think maybe it's common sense. Ethiopia is really frequently affected by drought. And then through this 33 is 50%. Even look, actually, we are looking at the pixel count again. The pixel is about 10 by 10 kilometers, about 100 kilometers. You can times the number on the y-axis times by 100, you get square kilometers, right? So almost 15% Ethiopia, more than 2,000 pixels is about 200,000 square kilometers affected with drought in the 22 different. So Ethiopia is a really kind of drought-prone country. And in 13 out of 22 years, more than 30% Ethiopia actually were affected by drought. This is, again, look at the overall, of course, this is some kind of particularly is affected a lot. Next slide, please. And then another complex about the drought and El Nino in Ethiopia is, drought and Nino is not the same. If you look here, El Nino, a lot aligned very well. It's affect, basically, in the in the 11 El Nino years, which, from 90 to 2000, only 6, this is I highlighted here, is 92, 95, 2003, 2005, 2015, 20 are drought years. Identify the drought index according to index I just pointed out. And the 14 years identified drought years is not El Nino year. And of the 12 drought years impacted more than 30% of Ethiopia, only 3 years, is El Nino years, 2003, 2015. So this is not El Nino created equal, and also drought years, El Nino years is not the same in Ethiopia. Next slide, please. And then here, I look at the space. So again, even the El Nino, look at the El Nino years and the drought years are the same, like the 6 years. And all the 6 El Nino drought years, if you can see, it's different. That's not El Nino years as I say, El Nino years are the same. Even the drought like 2015 actually is a huge drought, happened close to 60 million rural people, or nearly 60% of the total can be affected. But on the other hand, if it's a drought like the 1992, which is presently hit on the left side, most left side here happened. The most affected regions is in Somalia and Bulashangu, Buma, these 2 districts. But again, the one constant is Somalia. If you look at Somalia, look at it differently. Even look at this drought and El Nino years. The Somalia is always drought prone. This is maybe it's not news for a lot of you. Next slide, please. And here we also look at the Malawi and Zambia. Malawi and Zambia actually we are follow the same methodology as Western presented, but the difference is now for Malawi and Zambia, instead of use national data, we use subnational data. So we focus on maize because focus is dominant crop, and then we look at historical record from 1984 to 2016. And then, as Western point out, we look at the anomalies, actual and the trend from this year. Again, the one thing I need to point out as Western or do, because of the El Nino happened here and the growing season is kind of, El Nino happens right now, but it's definitely a growing season next year. So sometimes there's like a 1 year shift. Next slide, please. So here we show the maize yield for the El Nino in Malawi. Malawi, of course, this is like on the top figure actually showing the national kind of average. We have the trend, and then on the lower bottom we show the detrended after detrended. So you can see, if you look again, one message is certainly is El Nino can have a Western order part have negative or positive. Most of these negative in Malawi, you can see, but there are also some positive years, right? Positive affected even on the maize year. If you look at all 11 years, the El Nino years during this study period, the negative impact over the national mean is about 11 percentage. If you look, but if you just pick up the negative years, right? Negative only 7 negative is much more severe, almost double, almost 22%. This is what we keep in mind is also negative positive part. So next slide, please. Similar to Zambia, but you can see Zambia yield. If you look at the previous slides, Malawi's yield is actually going up. But if you look at Zambia, the yield actually kind of, it's not more like first going down and going up again. Again, if you look at national average, this is only about 8%. But if you look at it's only the negative El Nino years, this is much severe, almost 1/4, 23% of quarter on the national average. Of course, there's a whole spatial kind of heterogeneity, which I'll talk about later. But the one thing I want to point out here in Zambia, we have 1 year data is missing, so 1995 data missing. So in that sense, we only compared to the Malawi study, we're always short of 1 year. Next slide, please. Now I'll go to a little bit of detail about again the spatial heterogeneity. So El Nino impact effect. This is a Malawi map again. On the right side is the map showing all the average, all the El Nino years, all the 11 El Nino years. On the right side is only pick up the negative affected years, only the 7 years. You can imagine, selective years is much worse in the sense. Even look at the categories, via categories, maybe you cannot see clearly, this is where, in the left side, even there's no negative 30, more than 30% kind of decline in the district level yield is gone in the average. Again, in the text, I show which year actually detailed which year is El Nino year, which is selective years. And we just a simple mean cutoff for define, right? Again, if you look at this here, if you look at the average elective, again, the spatial, it's most affected year, this is a dark red one, this region district have almost 35% of Ukraine. So sometimes average actually kind of hidden, the severity about the local level. Next slide, please. Here we look at a little bit about the people, rural people affected. So what we show, we use remember only look at the background map is the 7 negative years yield impact. This is the same map I showed before, but the bar chart shows in the affected population by each district. And then if you think it's overall, almost more than half of rural population, even the district maize yield almost 15 to 30% lower than the kind of reduction, right? And then another kind of message is also 30% rural people are in one region. You can see Magachi and Salima and Balaska. This is a few regions. It's also highlighted the spatial heterogeneity affected by the locally. Next slide, please. Now we are looking, at the electric impact and the yield impact on the maize yield. Again, just showing the 3 categories. Maize yield production. 60% in the 15 to 20% kind of yield reduction. Also 20% of maize areas in the few kind of dark blue, dark red regions. Next slide, please. Here, actually, going from maize, going to the old crop area. Again, you're showing, again, this is also similar for Malawi, the crop area, in 15 to 20% reduction yield, right? Almost more than half of the Malawi crop area is affected. So the affected area is quite large. Go to the next slide, please. I think the Zambia case is a little bit, it's a similar, we are probably similar, so I'll go through that very quickly because time constraints. I know there's a Zambia question. If you are from Zambia, the other question, you can see the map where you are living, And Zambia is a similar story like Malawi, but you can see this, again, the spatial heterogeneity. Look at the affected area, just look at the right side of the figure. If the worst affected regions actually is the southern Zambia. There's a lot of stuff. This is where dark red. Go next slide, please. Yeah, this is also showing the rural population. Again, more than half of the population is affected because of this. You are talking about 15 to 20% kind of lower of yield, maize yield. Next slide. Yeah, I think this is showing again is the maize area. Next slide. This is total crop area. Those crop area similar figures. Again, is almost 50% of the crop area is affected in the 15 to 20% of kind of range of impact. Next slide. So I will summarize maybe some with 3 points. Not all El Niños are created equal. The impact of El Nino could be negative or positive, and the severity varies from the year to year. Again, there's El Nino impact crop and rural population have huge spatial heterogeneity. Subnational analysis is necessary. It's almost like self-promoting, but we do realize this kind of local impact is kind of different from region to region. Also, the variation of Nino impact, both in time and space, have huge implications for policy intervention, in particular for preparation and planning for El Nino. I think hopefully our next speaker will talk a little bit more on the policy implication side. Go back to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Liang. That was very comprehensive, and thank you so much for the detailed information you've provided. For me, just the one question I'd like to ask you, Liang, is if I were a person in any of the 3 countries you've described, and I was working in disaster preparedness, what would be the key message you'd give me as somebody who's working in this area in terms of what you've looked at through the past years, and then what should I be preparing for if I were working in this area? Thank you.
Okay, this is a very good question, actually. Yeah, you're right. I think it's this key message I'm trying to say is, this whole spatial heterogeneity also from also kind of temporal heterogeneity. So if you were looking at if we were prepared, planning for that thing, targeting is important. The targeting, you look at this, you have to look at this different impact, both in terms of the production, productivity, and the rural population. So in preparatory location, right? It's location. So where is affected? So remember, they also have the positive impact. So this is hopefully that give you a kind of targeting, kind of more kind of well prepared for some regions, and then not have the kind of one size fit all policy in that part. On the other hand, of course, it's also very important to know, of course, I mean, the predictive, also uncertainty part. I think it's Western, even our and Joe and Abdullah also presented. This is a lot of uncertainty. How do you build uncertainty within your preparation? That is much more important than planning and the preparation for deal with El Nino.
Thank you, Liang. And maybe just to follow on the question that was asked by one of our participants around Zambia when Weston was giving his presentation. So if I were a smallholder farmer, what exactly, a smallholder farmer in Zambia, what exactly would be important for me to know out of all this vast information that you've given us? Thank you.
Yeah, I think if you look at the Zambia map, if you are the farmer who asks the question is living in the southern part, unfortunately, this is most from a historic point of view is mostly affected by that one. If you are lucky in the northern part, as Weston said, Zambia, unfortunately, in the border, in the northern part, you are maybe luckier. In that sense, I would say, you have to prepare, for the worst, right? Even in the southern part, particularly, that will be affected. If you are lucky, this, of course, they still have unpredictability, as I said, a lot of uncertainty. But from historical point of view, you are actually, affected. You have to prepare for the worst case scenario in Zambia, southern part.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Liang. Over to you, Channing.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Liang. That was really interesting. So we're going progressively tighter, and I think it's fascinating that there's these effects that when it's negative. So it's not always negative. The impact is not always negative, but when it's negative, it's quite strongly negative, and that's true in both Zambia and Malawi. We have actually a question that just came through on what are the contingency plannings taken to adaptation to the effect of El Nino. And actually this whole next presentation really is headed towards that. So I'm going to ask Joaquin de Wert, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI and also the country program leader for IFPRI in Malawi, to please take over the moderation, and we'll run through almost on exactly that question for the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Channing. And indeed, we'll take a closer look at what the possible socioeconomic consequences of El Nino could be in a country like Malawi. Malawi is often in the eye of the storm when it comes to weather-related events. Unfortunately, sometimes quite literally. Like in February, we just had a tropical storm Freddy that caused havoc in the country in the south, leading to loss of lives and livelihoods. And now, as the previous presenters have pointed out, we're possibly facing drought conditions in much of the country because of El Nino. And so in this part, we'll have two speakers. The first is James Thurlow, who is the director of IFPRI's Foresights and Policy Modeling Unit. He will talk about the kind of ripple effects in agricultural production shortfall, like the one that might possibly be induced by El Nino, could have on the Malawian economy and on the Malawian people. And then we'll move on to our guest, Andrew Jamali. He is the research manager at Malawi's National Planning Commission, and he's been coordinating an evidence-gathering exercise to inform policymakers here in Malawi. And Andrew really has his finger on the pulse when it comes to policy formulation here in Malawi, so we're really happy to have him talk to us about the work that his team has been able to do to inform the responses here in Malawi. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Joachim. So as Joachim said, or as everyone has stressed, we don't know exactly what El Nino might mean for Malawi in the coming year, in this current growing season. And as Liang has just pointed out, we really do need to focus on sort of where within Malawi or where within Zambia the impacts are likely to be most severe. So what we do now is we turn to based on the work that Liang has done, we now turn to looking at what the impacts might be on the economy, on poverty, on undernourishment in Malawi. And that provides a context around which Andrew will talk about the policy responses. Next slide, please. So we're very much building on the work that Liang has just presented, and you can see on the right-hand side some familiar maps now showing where in Malawi the impacts on maize yields or maize production might be most severe. And so we don't know which of these scenarios or what type of El Nino event Malawi may experience this year, but we can use historical information to develop some scenarios so that we can then use some of our models here at IFPRI to estimate broader impacts on the economy and population. And so we're going to run two different scenarios. We're going to have a baseline scenario to begin with that is a typical business as usual without the impacts of El Nino, but two different El Nino scenarios. The first we're going to call a typical El Nino scenario, which is where we go back and we look at those 11 years that Liang talked about, and we take an average of those 11 El Nino events. And we can see on the right-hand side, under the typical scenario, there's about an 8% decline in maize production and obviously impacts on other crops as well. But then we also run what we call an adverse El Nino scenario. This is one where we just focus in on an average of those El Nino events that led to a decline in maize production relative to trend. And you can see on the furthest right-hand figure that there was a 20% reduction in maize production on average over those 7 El Nino events. And this gives us two scenarios measuring different possible scales of El Nino impacts in Malawi. Next slide, please. So we're going to use a frame of IFPRI's FARMS, which is a foresight and rapid response modeling system. And it consists of a lot of country models. In this case, we're just going to use Malawi. And these models, which we call RIAPA, have two key characteristics that make them good tools for this type of analysis. The first is that they are economy-wide. So we've seen from Liang, for example, impacts on maize production or on broader agriculture. But we know that shocks to agriculture can spill over and ripple through the rest of the economy, including maize milling, food services, other sectors of the economy. So we want to capture and certainly for poultry and other sectors within agriculture. So we want to capture the spillover effects from maize and from other crops to the broader food system and economy. The second is these models are macro-micro. So we can trace the effects of production in different agricultural subsectors through employment, household incomes, poverty, and food security down to the household level. So this is an ideal tool for doing this kind of broader analysis. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give 3 different pieces of results, very high-level results. The first on GDP, the second on poverty, and the third on undernourishment. So starting here on this slide, the impacts on GDP, on the economy. The first thing I should stress is that Malawi, as you know, is a very agrarian economy. Agriculture is about a quarter of the economy. Maize is about a quarter of agriculture. And the agri-food system makes up almost half of Malawi's economy. So it's no surprise that shocks to agriculture during a typical or adverse El Nino year are going to have economy-wide implications. It reduces farm incomes, it disrupts supply chains, and reduces national income overall. And you can see on the right-hand side the results from our 2 different scenarios. These are changes from the baseline. And you can see here under a typical El Nino year, a decline in agriculture of about 9% during a typical El Nino year. That has implications for the broader agri-food system, about a 7% decline as those production shocks in agriculture ripple through the supply chains, and an impact on the overall economy, economy, about a 4% decline in GDP. This is very much in line with past analysis of droughts in Malawi. On the right-hand side, you can see during an adverse El Nino year, much bigger impacts on the economy, almost double the size, but more than double the size in terms of total GDP. Next slide, please. So what does GDP mean? GDP is national income, but we're also interested in what it's going to do to poor households' incomes. And El Nino is going to affect poverty in two different ways. It's obviously going to affect farmers. Falling maize yields or falling crop yields more generally are going to lead to falling farm incomes, and that's going to hurt a very poor segment of the population. But it's also going to lead to rising food prices in Malawi, which is going to affect a lot of households that are not engaged in farming, but are big food consumers. And actually, the poor in Malawi, whether they're in rural or urban areas, spend a large chunk of their income on food consumption. So rising prices can have a big impact on them too. The second thing to note about Malawi is that poverty is unfortunately already very high. And so many of the households that are near the poverty line, they're also in urban areas and they're not farmers. And so what we're seeing when we run the modeling analysis is that El Nino pushes many more households deeper into poverty, about a 1.5 to 2.5 percentage point increase in the national poverty rate. That's over 600,000 people in the adverse Malawian scenario pushed into poverty as a result of El Nino. Also, many people already in poverty pushed even further into poverty. What's interesting from this results is that the poor households in urban areas are actually amongst the worst affected or the most vulnerable to these effects, because when maize prices rise or crop yield prices rise, that can actually offset some of the income losses that farmers face in rural areas. But for poor urban households, it's just a simple increase in food prices. But we do still see poverty rising in rural areas. Next slide, please. Here is a similar set of results looking at undernourishment, the number of households who don't consume a minimum calorie threshold. And we can see El Nino is going to reduce calorie availability in the country quite significantly. And there's going to be a consequent increase in undernourishment, again, between about 1.5 and 2.5 percentage points of the population. Rural households in this case actually do experience a larger increase in undernourishment than they did poverty. And that's because when calories are not available, it doesn't matter whether or not prices are rising and your incomes aren't falling as much. A lack of calories is going to mean that there is an increase in undernourishment or calorie availability for everyone across the country. In this case, in the adverse scenario, about 500,000 more Malawians become undernourished as a result of the shock. Next slide, please. And so just to summarize, we need to keep in mind that El Nino years differ, and we've just looked at an average of the historical El Nino events. And so the results are indicative, right? We're not making predictions at this point, but we do suspect, based on our modeling analysis and historical experience, that there will be quite significant economy-wide impacts, much slower GDP growth during this period. I haven't shown the shock in the recovery period, but about a year or two's worth of development could be lost as a result of this El Nino event in an adverse year. But we do expect, based on our modeling analysis and experience, that there will be a worsening of poverty and undernourishment. We've done similar analysis for Zambia, and we found quite similarly sized impacts. And so preparing policy responses, as everyone has suggested, is crucial. This is something that really is going to be important in the case of Malawi. And so I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to talk about some of those responses that are taking place already. Thanks.
Could you please present the slide? Right, so like my two colleagues mentioned, I think the analysis has been quite eye-opening in the context of Malawi's policy space, with the fact that we're looking at how these El Nino conditions would have to make us think through the policy space and how we reorganize our response with regards to programming to alleviate and offset the damages or the likely effects of these conditions in as far as the country is concerned on the people. So there's been some collaborative research that we've been doing with IFPRI and other partners in the country. We're looking at the economy-wide effects of these El Nino conditions. And we have also made some kind of advisory to the presidency and some ministries that are concerned with this, like Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Economic Affairs and Finance, who actually houses the social protection policy and its operationalization in the space. But we've also been supporting foresight policy analysis and planning processes across government ministries in response to the revelation that Malawi is really in these El Nino conditions with these, economy-wide effects, particularly starting with food situation, wealth, farm productivity losses, erosion of household production capacities, as well as implications on household incomes and stuff like that. So we've been working on this, and so far there have been some tremendous response across the space in terms of, first of all, acknowledging that we are in not normally uncharted territories, but queer circumstances of the charted territories, because now this El Nino is coming at the backdrop of other crises that Malawi has been going through, recent of which is the devaluation of the kwacha, which is the local currency, against the major trading currencies like the dollar, and that kind of erodes our input capacities, the forex reserves, which in the context of the current food crisis, now that we are proceeding into the lean season, coupled with the projected El Nino conditions, is likely to affect our ability to produce Malawi in this particular cropping season. Next slide, please. So what kind of policy interventions are actually underway? First of which is that there's been an early warning signal sounded across the space, targeting farmers and policymakers respectively, with different messages. For farmers, an indication that this season is not going to be normal. We're likely to see some variations in normal patterns of rainfall, and already the temperatures, the ambient is quite high, and that's going to have an implication on the rainfall or precipitation patterns, and that has direct implications on cropping season characteristics to do with maybe onset of rainfall. We're talking about its duration, the number of dry days in the season across the country is quite varied, much more pronounced negatively in the south and central region of the country. So that early warning signal has been presented across the space, and farmers have been advised to really work on less water kind of demanding crops, varieties, particularly cereals and legumes. So we're talking about working on pigeon peas, groundnuts, crops that may not demand as much water as it is in the season. And the use of also drought-tolerant kind of varieties, early maturing seed varieties, and also facilitating irrigation in spaces where it is possible to access water sources, water for the farms among the population, particularly those in the rural areas that are likely to be affected. So that's at a farm level. And then at the government level, there's been some kind of movement in terms of distributing food resources and social cash transfers to the vulnerable population. But I must highlight that this is in response to the lean season, which is coming at the backdrop of frequent bouts of cyclones that have also affected production in the previous years, the slowed kind of productivity in the economy as a result of COVID and other global health pandemics that have been hitting Malawi of late. For the El Nino part of it, government is now restructuring itself, reorganizing its policy space and strategy on how the number of people experiencing food insecurity and possible malnutrition is likely to increase as a result of a population that will suffer the El Nino conditions. So what is going on now is some kind of in-house understanding between government departments like the Department of Disaster Management Affairs, the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, which looks at social cash transfers, and the National Planning Commission, looking at how best we need to reconfigure the response space with regards to these El Nino conditions. So there are talks about ensuring that we should stockpile food and make sure that there is a proper targeting, because not all household populations, not all rural population in the country will be affected equally. Like the two colleagues mentioned, there's going to be some really spatial and temporal dynamics associated with the impacts of these El Nino conditions. But the issue at stake is that there is going to be some targeted, response with regards to additional pressure, with regards to household food security and nutrition, imposed upon by the, oncoming and incoming already El Nino conditions. So government is also trying to look at options of food importation. Suffice to mention that when we talk about food importation, as you can see that our immediate partner, our immediate neighbors, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, which would have been next door to know when it comes to food importation, are already experiencing similar conditions. So what that means is there is a need to cast the net wider to other regions outside within the context of Malawi. But that has got implications on the forex reserves, which the country is already suffering as a result of the financial and macroeconomic conditions that are not in the good shape. So this El Nino conditions is already plunging Malawi into a precarious condition, both in terms of fiscal space responses to these El Nino conditions and the productive capacities that have to be addressed to facilitate farmers to produce steel using irrigation measures and other interventions, but also providing social protection measures to households in the rural areas that are likely to be affected by these conditions. So just in a nutshell, those are some of the issues that are being considered and being debated upon within the response space regarding El Nino impacts in Malawi. I think I'll pause there. That could be my last slide, I should think. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew and James, for an excellent presentation. I think, let me jump in with a few questions. So first, to you, James, you and your team have been modeling economy-wide effects of a number of recent shocks in a variety of countries. So I was curious how these modeled El Nino scenarios that you just presented, how they compare, and I mean, sort of in terms of magnitude, their distribution, their pathways to other shocks that you've been looking at, like COVID-19, Ukraine war, etc., in Malawi or in other economies. And I should add to that a question which I think you could probably deal with in the same response from somebody who asks, could you say more about why rural households in Malawi are so much more affected by undernourishment compared to urban households?
No, thanks, Joachim, and thanks for that question from the audience. I think you're absolutely right. I think we are so used to nowadays, accepting the fact that we have dealt with one crisis after another back to back, and so it's an obvious question whether or not what Malawi may experience this year is worse than something as severe as, say, COVID-19. So we've been doing some of this analysis in Malawi in the past, and the impacts of say COVID on agriculture were actually relatively muted. We compared to, say, industry and services, and so COVID-19 had a big impact on the overall economy, but the impacts on agriculture were actually fairly small, and so by implication, the impacts on poverty and food security were less severe. It was more the downstream parts of the food system that were affected by lockdowns and other COVID policies, and that's shown up in the GDP number for agriculture, which actually continued to grow during the COVID period. In fact, it accelerated above expectations. In the case of Ukraine, though, that was an impact on, say, fertilizer and food prices, and although wheat is not as important for Malawi as maize, it did lead to an increase in the cost of food, and as Joe said, we're still waiting to see what the impacts on fertilizer may be, but we know in Malawi there have been troubles in distributing fertilizer, and that impact on farmers was actually quite severe. So in terms of magnitude, the impact on El Nino is actually significantly higher on the overall, or significantly larger than say, COVID-19 or Ukraine by a factor of 4. So we're expecting a 4% decline in GDP under a typical El Nino year, whereas in the case, the combined effect of COVID and Ukraine was only about a 1% decline in GDP during those years. The impacts on poverty during El Nino in Malawi, that's a factor of 2 larger. So we would expect El Nino to have twice as large an impact on poverty and undernourishment than we saw during either COVID or Ukraine. So El Nino is the largest crisis of the 3 that Malawi has faced in the last few years. Why is the impact on rural undernourishment so much larger than say, poverty? Well, when it comes to measuring poverty, what really matters is household incomes and real incomes after you've accounted for the change in prices. And in the case of rural farmers in Malawi, they're being hurt by the decline in food production. Their incomes are going down, but this is being offset by higher prices. And so their impact on incomes is perhaps less severe than it would be if you were a non-farmer just facing the increase in prices. But for undernourishment, what matters is the availability of calories, and that can't be offset by an increase in prices. And so we're seeing a big decline in staples production in Malawi during a typical El Nino year, and that just leads to less calories, more expensive calories, but less calories for everyone. And that's why rural households, rural farmers, still experience an increase in undernourishment. Thanks, Joachim.
All right. Channing, I should ask you, can I ask one more question, or should I hand over to you?
You can go quickly, and then I will go up. So just 1 minute, please.
Very good. So, Andrew, I was curious. We mentioned the 44% devaluation on 9th of November in Malawi. Then a week later, on the 15th of November, the IMF announced that it would there would be a staff monitored program with an extended credit facility. Do you see this as how do you see this impacting the response of the government? Is this an important evolution? What do you think will happen in the months going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Joachim. I think that just quickly, I think the coming in of the IMF staff monitor program on the extended credit facility, which is a temporary relief to countries that are experiencing hard, macroeconomic conditions to do with credit crunches, lower forex reserves. It is just going to ease a little bit the kind of forex squeeze that Malawi was experiencing, enabling it to really activate certain productive facilities within this. The economy, which could ride on the tide of the fact that there's a temporary relief in terms of the, forex base of the country. So, inappropriate investment of this kind of credit facility would definitely augment the country's, squeezing, really decomposing fiscal space. But appropriate management of likely to be investments will also facilitate a proper, response to this kind of crisis that Malawi is going through, because most likely, if it is well managed as a facility, it's going to provide some kind of stability in terms of prices of commodities, including food, which will help households to access the food. Other than that, if it's not well managed in that respect, then obviously we should expect continued kind of inflation, which is going to drive food prices way up high, unreachable to many of the households, particularly in the rural areas, and creating much more food insecurity, hunger, and consequently malnutrition. So it depends on how government is really maneuvering in the space to manage this, extended credit facility. But also suffice to mention that this is a positive development, because we've seen incoming support from other, multilateral partners that we have in the country that are riding on the tide of positivity that the ECF has granted Malawi. So we're hoping that with the coming in of these additional resources from other partners in development, we should be able to ride on that and navigate through the terrain of shortage of food with minimal kind of impact to the population.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that response. Over to you, Channing.
Thank you very much. I want to give a thanks to our audience for joining us. I hope this was useful. I found it extremely illuminating. I'd like to give a thanks to all of our speakers. Special thanks to Andrew, to Karen, and to Weston for joining us. And we look forward to, we hope this was useful, and we look forward to doing more of these events in future. So goodbye, and we hope this was useful. Cheers.